On a silent winter morning, Graham Vale found a trail dragging through the snow toward his porch. At the end of it stood Hawthorne, an aging German shepherd pulling an injured puppy with the last of his strength. Graham had already decided to leave Sunbreak Hollow and never be needed again, but the dog had come to the one door he believed would still open. What began as a rescue soon forced Graham to face a harder question. Can helping someone become another way of controlling them? And could an old dog teach an entire town that real strength means making room for others? Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Late January sunlight lay over Sunbreak Hollow with a pale blue clarity that made even ordinary things seem newly made. Snow rested along the roofs of the cedar houses, rounded the tops of split-rail fences, and gathered in the dark arms of the pines. Beyond town, the frozen lake reflected the morning sky like dull silver. Wind moved loose powder across the road in long, low ribbons, erasing tire tracks almost as soon as they appeared. Graham Vale stood on a short ladder outside his workshop, loosening the final screw from the wooden sign above the door. Vale Winter Repair. The painted letters had faded unevenly. The word winter was nearly gone, worn down by 16 seasons of snow, sleet, and mountain wind. At 61, Graham still had the height and broad, disciplined frame of a man who had once trained his body for difficult places. His olive-drab combat shirt fit close across his chest, while camouflage sleeves covered his arms beneath a weathered canvas vest. Silver showed clearly at both temples of his ash-brown hair. His nose bent slightly to one side, and an old, curved scar near his left eyebrow became more visible whenever he narrowed his gray-green eyes. He removed the sign carefully, though no one was waiting to buy it. Inside the workshop, the shelves were already half empty. The last metal lathe had been collected 2 days earlier. Most of the hand tools had been sorted into crates marked Sell, Keep, or Donate. Only the old green toolbox with the white streak across its lid remained beneath the workbench. On the desk lay a road map of Florida. A circle had been drawn around a small Gulf Coast town Graham had never visited. Beside the map, a date on the calendar had been marked in black pencil, February 18. 3 weeks from now. The date was not tied to a job, appointment, or promise. That was the point. Graham climbed down, set the wooden sign against the wall, and rolled his right shoulder until the old joint gave a quiet complaint. For years, people had told him he was lucky to be useful. He had once believed them. When furnaces failed after midnight, they called Graham. When snowmobiles overturned in ditches, they called Graham. When generators refused to start during an outage, someone always knew where to find him. There had been a time when every knock at the door had given him purpose. Gradually, purpose had become expectation. Then expectation had become something heavier, something no one seemed to notice because Graham carried it without asking anyone else to touch it. A year earlier, Harvey Lott's furnace had begun making a hard knocking sound. Graham had replaced a damaged part, but warned Harvey that the entire unit needed to be changed before the next winter. Harvey had laughed and said, "You'll keep the old thing alive." That December, the furnace stopped during a freezing night. Graham had crossed an icy road at 2 in the morning, restarted the system, and stayed until the house warmed. No one had been hurt. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet Harvey had stood in his kitchen afterward and complained that Graham's earlier repair should have lasted longer. The words had remained with Graham because part of them was true. He had taught Harvey, and half the town, that preparation was unnecessary as long as Graham Vale could be summoned. He had solved problems faster than people could learn from them. He had mistaken being dependable for being responsible for everything. Now he intended to leave before another winter convinced him to stay. Graham carried the ladder toward the storage shed. He was reaching for the padlock when a faint scraping noise passed beneath the wind. He stopped. The sound returned, not footsteps, not a branch moving over the roof. Something heavy dragged across the frozen ground, paused, then moved again. Graham set down the lock and stepped around the corner of the workshop. At first, he saw only wind-blown snow moving between the trees. Then a dark shape emerged along the service road. A German shepherd was struggling toward the house. The dog's coat was golden wheat beneath a broad, uneven saddle of black. Snow clung to his chest and belly. His muzzle had gone nearly silver with age, and the tip of his left ear folded outward. Between his teeth he held a leather-wrapped strap attached to a canvas rescue sling. Inside the sling lay a German shepherd puppy. The older dog pulled once, stopped, and stood with his legs spread for balance. His right hind leg trembled. He looked toward the porch, lowered his head, and pulled again. "Hawthorne?" The dog's amber eyes lifted. Graham recognized him from Northlight House. Years ago, when Graham still maintained the community's generator, Hawthorne had often accompanied Otis Keene to the workshop. The dog would lie beneath the porch bench while the two men argued cheerfully over wiring diagrams. Hawthorne took 3 more uneven steps. The sling crossed beneath the shelter of the porch roof. Only then did he release the strap. He lowered himself beside the puppy rather than collapsing outright, as if even exhaustion had to wait until the smaller animal was safe. His front legs folded. His chest touched the boards. The silver muzzle came to rest against the edge of the canvas. Graham moved quickly, but kept his voice low. "All right, you made it." The puppy could not have been more than 10 weeks old. Her sable coat was wet and flattened against her narrow body. One ear stood halfway, while the other folded softly over itself. Her left front paw remained lifted against her chest. She shivered when Graham touched the blanket beneath her. Hawthorne raised his head. "I'm taking her inside." The old dog watched Graham lift the sling. Only after the puppy was carried through the door did Hawthorne try to stand. His back legs failed on the first attempt. Graham returned, slid one arm beneath the dog's chest and the other beneath his abdomen, careful not to force the stiff joints. Hawthorne was lighter than Graham remembered, though still large enough to make the old injury in Graham's shoulder burn. Inside the house, Graham placed the puppy on a folded blanket near the wood stove. He dried her with a towel and wrapped a warmed cloth around her body, leaving enough space for heat to escape gradually. Hawthorne lay beside her. Graham brought a bowl of water and set it near the old dog's muzzle. Hawthorne smelled it but turned his face away. "You walked all this way and now you're particular?" The dog's attention remained fixed on the puppy. Graham moved the bowl until it rested between them. Hawthorne drank. The small choice unsettled Graham more than the journey through the snow. The dog had not refused because he was confused or too weak. He had been waiting until the water was close enough to the puppy that leaving her side was unnecessary. Graham took out his phone and called Dr. Tessa Grant. Tessa answered on the 3rd ring. "What happened?" "I've got Hawthorne from Northlight House and a shepherd pup. They came in from the East Service Road. The puppy's cold and favoring one front leg. Hawthorne's exhausted. I'm 10 minutes away. Keep them dry. Warm them slowly. Don't give the puppy food yet." Graham ended the call and examined Hawthorne's worn canvas harness. A small pouch had been fastened behind the identification tag. Inside was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Otis, at East Maintenance Shelter. Knee hurt. Radio dead. Please help Mika." For several seconds, Graham stared at the message. Then training took over. Not the part of him that rushed toward danger, but the quieter part that arranged facts before acting. Otis was alive when he wrote the note. The East Maintenance Shelter was less than a mile from Northlight House. The main service road would be blocked, or Otis would have returned on his own. Graham called Caleb Rourke. The volunteer fire chief answered with engine noise behind him. "Vale?" "Otis Keene is sheltering along the East Service Route. Injured knee, no radio. Hawthorne brought a puppy to my place." There was a brief silence. "You're certain the note is current?" The paper is dry inside a wet harness. Hawthorne has fresh snow packed between his pads. I'll take the tracked rescue vehicle. Stay with the dogs. Graham looked toward the workshop window, where wind was already softening the drag marks Hawthorne had left behind. I'll send you the exact location. You're not coming, Graham. Caleb's tone was firm without becoming confrontational. I didn't say I was. You were about to. Graham almost argued, then looked at Hawthorne, who had already done more than his body should have allowed. I'll stay. Tessa arrived in a rust-red quilted coat over green scrubs, her dark auburn hair braided over one shoulder. Freckles crossed the bridge of her nose, and she carried a brown medical bag that had been repaired in several places. She knelt beside Micah first. The puppy gave a faint protest when Tessa examined the lifted paw, but did not pull away. Sprain, most likely. No obvious fracture, Tessa said. She's chilled and worn out, but her breathing is clear. She checked Hawthorne next, running careful hands along his ribs, shoulders, and hindquarters. When she flexed his right rear leg, he turned his head toward her but made no sound. Low temperature, overworked muscles, swollen joints. He pushed too hard. He had a reason. That doesn't make it safe. Tessa looked up at Graham. Loyal animals don't always stop when they should. That's supposed to be our job. The remark landed closer to home than she could have known. Tessa instructed Graham to keep Hawthorne warm, quiet, and indoors for at least 72 hours. Micah would need rest, support around the injured paw, and another examination after the swelling decreased. Hawthorne barely reacted while Tessa worked. Only when Micah shifted beneath the blanket did his eyes open fully. An hour later, the low growl of a tracked rescue vehicle approached through the snow. Caleb entered first, broad-shouldered in a yellow-brown winter rescue coat. His red-gray beard was crusted with ice, and a radio rested against his left shoulder. Otis Keene came behind him on a folding support chair, one leg wrapped and elevated. At 72, Otis remained solidly built, though his round face looked pale beneath a rust-orange knit cap. A short white mustache moved when he tried to make a joke about becoming cargo. The joke disappeared when he saw Hawthorne. Otis pushed himself upright before Caleb could stop him. He crossed the room slowly, lowered himself beside the dog, and placed both trembling hands around Hawthorne's silvered face. You stubborn old fool. Hawthorne opened his eyes and pressed his nose into Otis's wrist. Otis swallowed. The drainage ditch gave way beneath the sled, he explained after a moment. Micah twisted her leg. My knee went with me. Then a birch came down across the return trail. He had reached the maintenance shelter but could not carry Micah and could not raise Northlight House on the damaged radio. The shortcut to your place was the only clear route, Otis told Graham. Hawthorne used to walk it with me. I put Micah in the sling, gave him the note, pointed him west. Otis looked back at the old dog. I told him, go to Graham. The room fell quiet, except for the wood settling in the stove. Graham had spent years believing trust was measured by how many problems a person could solve. Hawthorne had offered another definition. The dog had trusted Otis enough to leave him behind. Otis had trusted Hawthorne enough to send him away, and both had trusted Graham to open the door. Caleb stepped beside the window. The east road is worse than we thought, he said. Part of the roadbed has dropped into the drainage channel. An ambulance won't get through safely. What about the southern service route? Graham asked. Not cleared, not approved for emergency access. Graham looked toward Otis. Northlight House stood beyond the eastern ridge, home to 8 older residents. Some could walk without assistance, others could not move quickly over snow. Without reliable access, one medical emergency could become much more difficult than it needed to be. I was going to take them back once Tessa cleared the dogs, Graham said. Caleb shook his head. Not today. Hawthorne stays here until Tessa releases him. Otis stays off that knee. Graham glanced through the open workshop door. The Florida map remained on the desk. Above it, the calendar still displayed the black mark around February 18. He had spent months preparing to leave Sunbreak Hollow because he was tired of being needed. Now a road had failed, a community had become harder to reach, and an old dog had crossed the snow because someone still believed Graham's door would open. For the first time since circling the date, Graham did not see it as a promise. He saw it as a question. 3 days after Hawthorne reached Graham's porch, the sun returned to Sunbreak Hollow. It did not bring warmth. It only sharpened the winter. Snow shone beneath a clear sky, bright enough to make Graham narrow his gray-green eyes as he drove up the southern road toward North Lighthouse. Hawthorne lay across the padded rear seat of the truck, wearing a moss-gray thermal coat over his golden and black fur. His silver muzzle rested between his front paws. Every turn caused one amber eye to open, then close again once he decided the truck was still moving in the correct direction. Micah traveled in a low crate beside him. A cream-colored support wrap protected her left front paw, though she had already decided the injury should not limit her ambitions. She chewed one corner of the blanket, abandoned it for the crate latch, then pressed her nose through the opening to investigate the back of Hawthorne's ear. Hawthorne released a tired breath without lifting his head. "You asked for this," Graham said. The old dog's ear twitched. Graham had intended to return the dogs, speak briefly with Otis, and leave before lunch. The workshop still held boxes that needed sealing. A buyer from Concord was scheduled to collect the remaining generator parts. Florida remained 3 weeks away, yet the closer he came to North Lighthouse, the more often his attention moved toward the road beneath the tires. The eastern route had been closed with orange barriers. Caleb's crew had marked the edge of the damaged section where frozen runoff had opened a long fracture beneath the snow. Graham could not see the full collapse from the truck, but he could see enough to understand that no ordinary repair would hold through the rest of winter. North Lighthouse appeared beyond a stand of white birch. The main building was long and low, constructed from honey-colored timber darkened by age. 8 private wings extended from a broad central structure, each with its own window, porch light, and small covered step. A winter greenhouse stood behind the house, its glass panels glowing pale green beneath the snow. Bird feeders hung from iron hooks. Someone had tied strips of red cloth to the nearest trees so they remained visible after heavy snowfall. It did not resemble a facility. It resembled a place people had chosen. Otis Keene waited near the entrance with one hand on a wooden cane and the other raised in greeting. His injured knee was wrapped beneath loose work trousers, but he had refused the folding support chair Caleb had brought him home in. A rust-orange cap covered his thin, gray hair. Hawthorne raised his head the moment he saw him. Graham parked close to the porch. Otis opened the rear door before Graham could walk around the truck. "Easy," Graham warned. "I am being easy. You nearly fell getting out of a chair 2 days ago. I fell getting into a ditch." Very different skill. Despite the reply, Otis waited while Graham clipped the lead to Hawthorne's chest harness. The old dog stepped down slowly. His right hind leg remained stiff through the first few movements, but when Otis crouched as far as his knee allowed, Hawthorne pressed his silver muzzle beneath the man's hand. Micah began complaining from inside the crate. "She has discovered injustice," Graham said. "She lives here," Otis replied. "She'll fit right in." The front door opened before Graham could answer. Marjorie Bellamy stood in the entrance, one hand resting against the frame. She was 77, straight-backed and slender, with silver-white hair cut neatly to her chin. Rectangular tortoiseshell glasses framed pale blue eyes that gave nothing away too quickly. A brick-red scarf lay over a dusty blue sweater, and a small silver key hung from a chain at her throat. "Mr. Vale," she said, "thank you for bringing them home." "Graham is enough." "Then Marjorie is enough." She stepped aside. Warm air carried the smell of coffee, cedar, and something baking with cinnamon. The central room opened around a stone fireplace. Bookshelves covered one wall. A long table occupied the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Beyond the kitchen, broad windows looked into the greenhouse, where winter greens grew beneath suspended lamps. There were medical call buttons near the doors, but there were also muddy gardening gloves, a half-finished puzzle, and a stack of library books waiting to be returned. Graham noticed systems before he noticed decoration. A laminated schedule listed meal preparation, greenhouse care, snow checks, and transportation duties. Emergency numbers were posted beside 2 landline phones. Backup lanterns hung from hooks at equal intervals. A portable oxygen unit sat inside a marked cabinet. The residents were not pretending risk did not exist. They had simply arranged their lives so risk did not define them. A woman with short salt and pepper curls approached, carrying a red-brown first aid pouch. Ruth Ann Cole moved with the direct, economical confidence of someone who had spent years entering rooms where panic had arrived first. She was broad-shouldered, with warm brown skin and amber eyes that examined Graham before she offered her hand. Ruth Ann, retired paramedic. I manage the medical supplies and remind everyone that aspirin does not repair personality. Has it been tested? Graham asked. Repeatedly, poor results. Her mouth almost became a smile. Near the table sat Nadine Carver, though everyone called her Nell. At 81, she was the smallest person in the room, but nothing about her seemed fragile. Her silver blonde hair formed a neat bob around a square, alert face. Red cat-eye glasses rested low on her nose. A short pencil was tucked behind her right ear, and both hands rested on a gray walker whose handles had been wrapped in reddish-brown leather. Nell looked at the crate Graham carried. That must be the resident who caused the transportation emergency. Micah answered by placing both front paws against the crate door. 10 weeks old and already under investigation, Graham said. Good. She should become accustomed to oversight. Otis opened the crate. Micah stepped out carefully, discovered the support wrap on her paw, and attempted to bite it. When the wrap did not surrender, she turned her attention toward the room. Hawthorne lowered himself onto a thick pad beside the fireplace. Micah wandered 2 feet away, hurried back to touch his shoulder, then ventured out again. Graham watched her inspect chair legs, shoes, and the fringe of Nell's scarf. She'll need to stay off stairs, he said. We know, Ruth Ann replied. The answer was not rude, but it carried a boundary. Before Graham could decide whether it bothered him, Caleb Rourke entered through the side door with 2 other people. Caleb wore his yellow-brown rescue coat open over a navy half-zip sweater. Melted snow darkened the shoulders, and his red-gray beard looked freshly combed, which meant he was attending in an official capacity. The man beside him was Marcus Dale, a retired civil engineer in his mid-60s. Marcus was narrow-faced and compact, with close-cut white hair and a posture that remained precise without seeming rigid. He carried rolled maps beneath one arm and wore a dark green field coat dusted with snow. The third arrival was Evelyn Frost. She removed her gloves 1 finger at a time before entering fully. Tall and composed, she wore a slate-gray coat over a charcoal turtleneck. Her smoke-silver hair was cut in a short bob, and a waterproof blue clipboard remained tucked beneath her arm. A vertical line between her eyebrows gave her a severe expression, though her gray-blue eyes moved carefully around the room rather than dismissively. "Thank you for meeting on short notice," she said. Marjorie gestured toward the long table. "We did not expect the county to wait." Graham heard the restraint beneath the words. Everyone took a seat except Otis, who lowered himself onto a stool near Hawthorne. Graham remained standing until Nell glanced at the empty chair beside her. "If you plan to speak," she said, "you may as well join the rest of the species." He sat. Marcus spread a topographic map across the table. Red pencil marked the eastern road, the damaged drainage channel, and the lower section where the roadbed had shifted. "The culvert failed beneath the freeze line," Marcus explained. "Water moved under the road, froze, expanded, and undermined the fill. The visible drop is only part of the damage." "How much can be repaired now?" Marjorie asked. Not enough to make it safe for emergency vehicles. A temporary patch would conceal the weakness rather than correct it. The proper repair requires excavation, new drainage, and stable temperatures. So, spring, Otis said. Spring, Marcus confirmed. Evelyn opened her clipboard. North Lighthouse currently meets the county's requirements for supported senior co-housing. However, your certificate assumes reliable emergency access and a tested evacuation plan. We have an evacuation plan, Marjorie said. You have one based on the Eastern Road. We have lived here for 9 winters. Evelyn did not raise her voice. And the road held for 8 of them. The silence that followed was different from the one in Graham's workshop. No one here was withdrawing. They were measuring one another. Evelyn continued. The county is not ordering anyone into residential care. That is not what this review means. But without emergency access, this building cannot continue operating under its current certificate. Nell removed the pencil from behind her ear. What happens if the certificate is suspended? You would need temporary housing until access is restored or an alternate plan is approved. For all 8 of us? Evelyn paused. There is no single placement available nearby. Marjorie's hand moved toward the silver key at her throat. Ruth Ann asked, "How many locations?" "Possibly 4. The words settled over the table. 4 locations meant Otis without Hawthorne. Nell in a building where she knew no one. The greenhouse closed. Shared meals ended. Morning routines broken into separate towns and unfamiliar rooms. Graham had expected resistance to regulation. Instead, he saw fear held behind disciplined faces. Not fear of being moved, fear of being divided. Micah had reached the edge of the rug. She lifted her wrapped paw and considered the wooden floor beyond it. Hawthorne watched from the fireplace but did not rise. "How long?" Marjorie asked. 10 days to submit and demonstrate a temporary access and evacuation plan, Evelyn said. If it meets the standard, I can authorize a 90-day winter extension. Graham leaned over the map. The Southern Service Route. Marcus nodded. Longer, less grade, but it has not been cleared for emergency use. It could be, Evelyn looked at him, with inspection. We clear the brush, mark the route, stage a tracked vehicle at the lower turn, and move medical supplies to an accessible point. He began seeing the process as he spoke. Close the greenhouse to reduce generator load. Pack essential medications by resident. Prepare transport order based on mobility. Anyone who can move independently goes first. Assisted residents follow once the route is confirmed. No one interrupted. That should have warned him. Graham reached for a pencil and marked 2 staging points. We can have personal bags ready by tomorrow. Caleb can identify temporary transport. Ruth Ann can rank medical needs. Marjorie can notify families. Why would I notify families? Marjorie asked. In case the plan fails. And why are you closing the greenhouse? To preserve fuel. The greenhouse has its own solar storage. Graham looked toward the glass structure. That system will not carry the heaters through a long outage. It does not need to. The thermal beds retain heat overnight. Not during a severe cold event. Ruth Ann folded her arms. You have been here 15 minutes. I have spent 35 years planning around what happens when systems fail. And how many of those plans involved Nell? Graham looked toward the older woman. Nell's expression remained calm. Where exactly have you placed me in your transport order? That depends on your mobility assessment. Who performs it? Ruth Ann? Ruth Ann's eyebrows rose. And if I say Nell can decide for herself? In an emergency, someone has to coordinate. Yes, Nell said, but who appointed you? The question was not sharp. That made it harder to dismiss. Graham set down the pencil. I am trying to keep 8 people from being stranded. Marjorie leaned forward. No, you are planning how to remove 8 people from their home. If you cannot evacuate safely, leaving may be the only option. We understand the danger. Then you understand why there is no time for everyone to debate every detail. The room went still. Micah chose that moment to reach the stairs. The first step was low, but the polished wood beyond it would be difficult with her wrapped paw. Hawthorne lifted his head. He did not hurry toward her. He placed one foreleg across the edge of the rug, blocking the most direct approach. Micah bumped into his leg, stepped back, and tried from another angle. Hawthorne shifted just enough to remain between her and the drop. He did not push her into the crate. He did not stand over her. He simply made the dangerous path unavailable while leaving the rest of the room open. Nell watched the two dogs. "There," she said quietly. Graham looked at her. "That is what we need. A dog in the hallway? A way to keep danger from taking our choices with it." The sentence stayed with him, though he did not yet know what to do with it. Caleb pulled the map toward the center of the table. "Here is what happens next," he said. "Graham gets 2 days to assess the southern route and existing equipment. He does not create a final plan alone." Graham opened his mouth. Caleb raised one broad hand. "Marcus approves anything structural. Evelyn decides whether it meets county requirements. The residents decide what they can use and what they will consent to." "And if they reject the safest option?" Graham asked. "Then you explain the risk," Evelyn said. "You do not erase their authority." Marjorie met Graham's eyes. "We are not asking you to make us comfortable. We are asking you to help us remain responsible for our own lives." Graham looked around the table. Otis, with his swollen knee and stubborn humor. Ruth Ann with her medical pouch beside her chair. Nell with the pencil and Walker. Marjorie holding together a community she feared losing. None of them denied that the road had failed. They simply refused to accept that the failure of a road meant the failure of their judgment. Graham nodded once. 2 days. It sounded like agreement. Inside, he still believed the discussion would cost them time they could not afford. The meeting ended with assignments rather than resolution. Marcus would inspect the southern route at first light. Caleb would bring access records and vehicle specifications. Evelyn would provide written standards. The residents would prepare individual mobility and medical information on their own terms. Graham stood near the fireplace while Otis adjusted Hawthorne's blanket. Micah had fallen asleep against the old dog's chest, one oversized paw resting on the pale, teardrop-shaped patch of fur there. Hawthorne's eyes remained open. He watched Graham without expectation. Outside, the sunlight had begun to fade from the birch trees. The snow turned from white to blue in the shadows, and Northlight House glowed warmer against the approaching evening. Graham had entered believing the problem was a damaged road. He left the room understanding that the road was only the first thing that had broken. He still did not know whether Northlight House could remain open. But he knew one thing clearly. No plan would succeed if it saved the building by taking the home away from the people inside it. The southern service road began behind the greenhouse and disappeared between birch trunks silvered by frost. Graham walked it shortly after sunrise with a measuring wheel in one hand and a notebook tucked beneath his arm. The road had once carried firewood from the lower forest. Years of disuse had narrowed it to 2 pale tracks divided by winter grass and young spruce. It was longer than the damaged eastern route, but the grade was gentler. Morning sunlight reached most of the slope, softening the upper layer of ice before noon. At the bottom, the road curved toward a level clearing wide enough for Caleb's tracked rescue vehicle. Graham marked drainage channels, low branches, and sections where the snow concealed uneven ground. He worked efficiently, alone by preference, turning the landscape into measurements and decisions. By the time he returned to Northlight House, he had already built the solution in his head. A powered rescue sled sat in the equipment shed. It had a low center of gravity, a padded passenger seat, and a small gasoline engine designed to pull supplies. With improved restraints and a second braking system, Graham believed it could move residents down the southern route faster than any manual arrangement. Speed mattered. A medical emergency did not wait for committees, explanations, or comfort. Inside the shed, he tested the brake cable, tightened the drive belt, and replaced a cracked buckle. Otis watched from a stool, his injured leg stretched forward, and Hawthorne lying nearby on a folded blanket. The old German shepherd had recovered enough to follow Otis for short distances, though the first steps after standing remained stiff. Micah stayed in a low pen near the open doorway, where Tessa Grant was checking the swelling around her supported front paw. "You intend to carry people on that?" Ruth Ann asked from behind Graham. "It was designed for transport of equipment. The frame can handle the weight." "That was not my question." Graham pulled hard on the restraint strap, testing the stitching. "The southern route is nearly half a mile. Anyone with limited mobility will need assistance. This is the quickest option." Ruth Ann folded her arms over her navy quilted vest. "Have you asked anyone how they handle vibration?" "The suspension is adequate." "Motion sickness?" "We keep the speed controlled." "Hip pain? Back pain? Fear of being strapped into a moving sled?" "In an emergency, discomfort is not the priority." Ruth Ann's expression changed only slightly. "People say that when the discomfort belongs to someone else." Graham closed the tool compartment. "I am not proposing a pleasure ride. I am trying to move 8 residents to a safe access point before conditions worsen. And I am trying to remind you that those 8 residents have nervous systems, medical histories, and opinions." Nell Carver approached with her red-framed glasses low on her nose. Her gray walker moved steadily over the packed snow, its leather-wrapped handles fitting beneath her gloved hands. "I will test it," she said. Ruth Ann turned. "You do not have to prove anything." "I am not proving anything. I am collecting evidence." Graham studied Nell. "The trial will be on the short upper slope, low speed. Caleb has already cleared it." "Good," Nell said. "Then we will learn something." Ruth Ann remained unconvinced, but Nell had made the decision herself. Graham helped position a portable step beside the sled and waited while Nell lowered herself onto the padded seat. He explained the buckle, the hand grip, and the emergency release. Nell tested each one before allowing him to fasten the outer restraint. "If I raise my left hand," she said, "you stop." "I will hear you. That was not the agreement." Graham met her eyes. "If you raise your left hand, I stop." The engine started with a hard mechanical cough. Hawthorne lifted his head and flattened his ears. He disliked the sound of generators and small engines, a fact Graham had forgotten. Otis rested a hand against the dog's shoulder until the vibration settled into a steady hum. Graham walked beside the sled for the first few yards, one hand near the control lever. The runners moved smoothly over the packed surface. Nell sat upright. Her face remained composed. At the beginning of the slope, Graham increased the power slightly. The sled moved faster. Not dangerously fast, not even close, but the uneven ground transferred a repeated shudder through the frame. The birch trunks passed in alternating bars of white and shadow. Nell's gloved fingers tightened around the grip. Graham watched the path ahead, judging the turn. Nell raised her left hand. Her sleeve blended with the dark side of the seat. Graham did not see it immediately. "Stop," she said. The engine and his insulated hat swallowed the first word. "Graham, stop." He looked back, cut the power, and applied the brake. The sled halted within several feet. Nell remained seated, eyes closed, both hands gripping the rail. Her face had lost its usual color. She drew one shallow breath, then another. Ruth Ann reached them first. "Do not unbuckle her yet," she said. "Give her space." Graham stepped back. Nell opened her eyes, but did not look at him. Ruth Ann spoke quietly, asking her to focus on one stationary birch tree rather than the slope. After a minute, Nell's breathing steadied. No one had been injured. The sled had performed exactly as Graham expected. That made the failure worse. He had tested the brakes, the engine, the restraints, and the turning radius. He had not tested the experience of being inside it. When Nell finally allowed the buckle to be released, she remained seated for another moment before using the portable step to stand. Graham offered his arm. She declined it without anger. Back at the equipment shed, silence followed them inside. Graham removed his hat. The speed was within a safe range. Ruth Ann turned toward him. "You checked the machine more carefully than the person using it." I stopped. After she asked twice. The engine covered her voice, which means the system failed. Graham felt the familiar pressure behind his ribs, the resistance that arrived whenever discussion replaced action. "I am trying to make sure everyone survives an evacuation." Nell adjusted the scarf at her throat. "Survival is not permission to hand every choice to the strongest person in the room. This is not about strength." "No," she said. "It is about who assumes authority before anyone gives it to him." Marjorie had entered during the exchange. She stood near the doorway in her slate blue winter coat, the brick-red scarf bright against the muted room. "Graham," she said, "Northlight House has weaknesses. Otis went out alone. Our equipment records are incomplete. We have avoided questions because we feared what the county might decide." "Then you understand why there is no time to turn every decision into a debate." "I understand why you are useful," Marjorie replied. "I do not yet understand why usefulness should make you our commander." The word struck harder than Graham expected. He looked from Marjorie to Ruth Ann, then to Nell, who stood with one hand on her walker but no longer looked unsteady. "You asked me to find a safe way out." "We asked you to help us build one," Marjorie said. "Those are not the same thing." At the workbench, Otis was attempting to fit a larger release pin into one of the restraint mechanisms. His hands had begun to shake. The small metal piece slipped from his fingers and struck the floor. He bent to retrieve it, winced at his injured knee, and sat back. "Leave it," Graham said. "I'll do it." "I have it." The pin fell again. Otis glanced toward the others. The humor usually present in his round face disappeared. He turned slightly away, as though the angle might hide what his hands were doing. His breathing became quick and shallow. Graham stepped toward him. "Hawthorne, come!" The old dog pushed himself upright. He took one step toward Graham, then stopped. Hawthorne looked at Otis. The man's trembling fingers had closed around the edge of the workbench. His shoulders were lifted too high. His breath came through his nose in short, uneven pulls. Hawthorne turned away from Graham and walked back to Otis. He sat against the man's left leg, close enough for his golden black shoulder to touch the fabric of Otis's work trousers. Graham called again. "Hawthorne!" The dog did not move. Otis lowered one hand onto the silver fur around Hawthorne's muzzle. His fingers still trembled, but his palm remained there. Gradually, his shoulders dropped. Tessa watched from beside Micah's pen. "He isn't disobeying you," she said. "He knows the command. He also knows Otis." Tessa closed her medical bag. "He has lived with that breathing pattern, that scent, and those hands for years. He does not understand why Otis is upset. He only knows something changed." Hawthorne did not demand that Otis recover quickly. He did not paw at him or pull him toward the door. He remained beside him. Graham thought about how often he had entered a difficult moment and immediately begun removing choices. "Sit here. Move now. Let me handle it. Do what I say." Hawthorne had done less. Somehow, it helped more. The test ended without another run. Ruth Ann took Nell inside for tea. Marjorie asked that no equipment be used again until every resident had been consulted. Graham agreed, though the word came slowly. By evening, he was back in his workshop with the powered sled raised on blocks. Florida's coastline stared up from the map on his desk. The blue water looked flat and unreal beneath the workshop light. Graham had believed he wanted warmth, distance, and anonymity. Now he wondered whether Florida had ever been a destination. Perhaps it was only a place where no one knew what he could do, and therefore no one could ask him to do it. He removed the rear brake assembly from the sled. A mounting plate had bent slightly under repeated use. Graham braced one boot against the workbench and tried to lift the assembly onto a metal stand. Pain caught in his right shoulder. He lowered the part, waited, and tried again. The shoulder refused. A knock sounded against the open door. Otis stood outside with Caleb behind him. Nell sat in Caleb's rescue vehicle, a clipboard resting across her knees. Graham looked at the three of them. "What is this?" "Your unfinished work," Nell called from the vehicle. "Apparently, it has developed witnesses." "I can manage." Otis entered and studied the brake assembly. "With one arm?" "My arm works. Not in the direction you need." Graham reached for the part again. Otis placed a hand on the metal, not forcefully, just enough to interrupt him. "I cannot lift it either," Otis said. "That does not mean it cannot be lifted." He found a short steel bar near the wall and positioned a wooden block beneath the assembly. Caleb brought in a portable support jack from the vehicle. Otis explained the angle. Caleb handled the weight. Nell read the part numbers from the inventory sheet and confirmed which replacement bolts Graham still had in storage. Graham stood near the workbench and gave instructions when asked. No one treated his injured shoulder as a failure. No one thanked him for sacrificing himself. No one suggested that accepting help made the workshop less his. The brake assembly rose into place with less effort than Graham had spent trying to move it alone. Otis fitted the enlarged release pin into the mechanism. His fingers shook, but the component did not require force. It required patience. The pin clicked into position. "There," Otis said. "A job for the wrong hands, completed by the right arrangement." Graham looked at the repaired mechanism, then at the three people who had finished it with him. For most of his life, accepting help had felt dangerously close to surrendering control. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like distributing weight. And weight, properly shared, did not disappear. It simply stopped crushing the person who had believed he had to carry it alone. The next morning, Graham returned to Northlight House before anyone expected him. The main room was still quiet. Pale winter light stretched across the long table, catching on abandoned coffee cups, reading glasses, and the corner of the map he had pinned to the wall the day before. Graham stood in front of it for several seconds. His original plan was still there in black marker. Transport order, departure sequence, equipment assignments, and estimated times. Every line was efficient, every arrow pointed in one direction, every decision belonged to him. He removed the paper from the wall. The sound of tape pulling free brought Marjorie from the kitchen. She wore a burgundy cardigan over an ivory blouse, and the silver key at her throat rested against one hand as she watched him fold the plan. "I was wondering how long that would remain there," she said. "Longer than it should have." Nell entered behind her, pushing her gray walker. A sharpened pencil sat behind her right ear, and a calculator hung from one wrist by a narrow strap. Graham faced her. "I owe you an apology." Nell stopped. "I tested the sled as if you were part of the equipment," he said. "I measured what the machine could do. I did not ask what the ride required from you." She waited, giving him no easier way through the sentence. "I put speed ahead of your sense of safety," Graham continued. "That was wrong." Nell adjusted her red-framed glasses. "Yes," she said. Graham almost smiled. "I was expecting a longer answer." "You gave a complete apology. I see no reason to damage it by adding decoration." Marjorie pulled out a chair. "What happens now?" Graham unfolded a clean sheet of paper and placed it in the center of the table. "Now everyone tells us what they can do, what they cannot do safely, and what they are willing to take responsibility for." By 8 o'clock, the table was full. Ruth Ann brought medical folders and 3 different sizes of emergency bags. Otis arrived with a box of enlarged buckles, hand grips, and brake components. Caleb carried vehicle specifications. Marcus Dale brought a small level, soil notes, and several photographs of the southern route. The remaining Northlight House residents joined them as well. Leon Vickers, 74, had once delivered mail across 3 rural counties. He was lean, long-armed, and carried himself with the patient balance of someone accustomed to icy steps. He knew every service road, abandoned farm track, and seasonal gate within 10 miles. Judith Wynne, 71, managed the greenhouse and kitchen supplies. Her dark silver hair was braided down her back, and she spoke softly until anyone suggested wasting food or fuel. She knew how long the greenhouse could retain heat without electric support, and which plants could be moved indoors. Franklin Ames, 68, had driven buses before arthritis forced him to retire. He used a cane only on uneven ground and had an exact memory for turning radius, braking distance, and how frightened passengers behaved when they felt rushed. Graham listened while each person spoke. At first, he had to resist the instinct to convert every sentence into an immediate solution. Nell explained that she could walk the entire southern route if given 2 seated rest points and enough time. She did not want to be strapped into a powered sled unless the route was physically blocked. Leon said he could guide a group through the lower trail in poor visibility, but his hearing aids became unreliable in heavy wind. Judith could manage stairs and carry light supplies, but cold air aggravated her breathing if she moved too quickly. Franklin could assist with vehicle positioning, but prolonged standing made his knees unstable. Ruth Ann wrote everything down without ranking anyone by strength. Nell began building a timetable. She did not calculate only walking speed. She added the minutes required to wake from sleep, dress in winter clothing, collect prepared medication pouches, and move through narrow doors without crowding. She included rest periods and time for one person to become confused or need reassurance. Graham leaned over the sheet. You added 6 minutes for leaving the bedrooms. 8 residents do not become ready at the same instant because a whistle blows, Nell said. In an emergency, they might have to. Then the plan must account for the fact that they will not. She tapped the pencil against the page. Fast estimates are comforting, accurate estimates are useful. Across the room, Ruth Ann arranged medical supplies into color-coded pouches. Red labels indicated medication that could not be delayed. Yellow labels marked useful but non-essential items. White cards contained only information each resident had agreed could be shared with emergency responders. Graham noticed the cards did not contain full medical histories. Caleb may need more information, he said. He needs what helps him respond, Ruth Ann replied. Not everything a person has ever told a doctor. The distinction was small, but it mattered. Consent had entered the plan not as a principle discussed around a table, but as a practical limit on what others were allowed to know. In the equipment shed, Otis worked on the manual brake system. He had replaced the narrow release pin with a large looped handle that could be operated through thick gloves. He also added a secondary restraint to prevent the sled from sliding backward if the towing line lost tension. His hands shook as he demonstrated it, but the new handle required no delicate grip. I kept trying to make my hands behave like they did 20 years ago, Otis said. Turned out the equipment could change instead. Graham examined the mechanism. That cable needs a protective sleeve. Otis nodded. Already measured. The anchor point is too close to the edge. Marcus said the same thing. Graham looked toward the retired engineer, who gave him a faint, knowing smile. For once, being late to the solution did not feel like losing. Outside, Marcus tested the packed ground at the lower clearing. The proposed point for Caleb's tracked vehicle looked level, but a probe revealed loose fill beneath the snow on the northern side. If the vehicle parks here, Marcus said, the rear tread may settle. Caleb studied the slope. We shift 12 feet south. That narrows the turn. Franklin approached with his cane planted firmly in the snow. Not if the driver enters backward from the lower fork. Caleb looked at him. You have used that turn? School bus during road construction, winter of 1998. Longer wheelbase than your rescue carrier. Caleb walked the line Franklin described, then nodded. That works. The plan had begun to take shape, but not from a single center. It developed like a network of paths, each person supplying knowledge the others did not have. Graham's role changed without anyone formally announcing it. He moved between groups. He noticed that Ruth Ann's medical bags would not fit beneath the sled's weather cover and asked Otis to alter the side mount. He connected Leon's concern about hearing and wind with Marjorie's proposed light signals. He suggested that Judith's greenhouse carts could transport blankets to the indoor staging area without anyone carrying heavy boxes. He was still useful. The difference was that usefulness no longer required ownership. Near noon, a sharp puppy bark came from the greenhouse. Micah had escaped her low pen by pushing a folded blanket against one side and climbing over it. Her front paw had improved enough that she now treated caution as an unreasonable restriction. She hurried toward the greenhouse door, where a single low step descended to the outer walkway. Hawthorne lay in a patch of sunlight nearby. His eyes opened when Micah reached the threshold. The old dog rose reluctantly. His right hind leg remained stiff for the first step. Micah placed one paw over the edge. Hawthorne moved below her and stood sideways across the landing. Micah tried the left side. Hawthorne shifted. She tried the right. He shifted again. The puppy gave an irritated yip and pawed at his shoulder. Hawthorne did not push her backward. He did not pick her up or force her into the pen. He simply occupied the place where a fall might occur. After several attempts, Micah turned around, noticed the indoor ramp used for greenhouse carts, and made her way down by the safer route. Hawthorne returned to the sunlight without waiting for praise. Marjorie had watched from the doorway. "That," she said, "is the plan." Otis glanced at the dog. "Sleep in the sun?" "Not quite." Marjorie looked toward the tables, the modified equipment, and the colored medical pouches. "No one is abandoned. No one is treated as luggage." The room went quiet, but this time the silence held agreement rather than resistance. Graham looked at Hawthorne. The old dog had not chosen Micah's destination. He had only removed the path most likely to harm her and left the rest open. It was a form of protection Graham understood in theory and had rarely practiced. That afternoon, Evelyn Frost arrived for a preliminary review. She wore a gray safety coat over dark trousers and carried a tablet protected by a heavy rubber case. She inspected the southern route, the indoor staging area, and the equipment modifications without offering immediate approval. Nell presented the evacuation timetable. Ruth Ann explained the medical triage system. Otis demonstrated the enlarged controls. Caleb described vehicle access, while Marcus outlined the limits of the temporary ground supports. Evelyn asked difficult questions. What happened if the generator failed? What if the main radio channel was unavailable? What if one resident refused to leave? What if the southern route became blocked after the first group had departed? This time, Graham did not answer first. Marjorie explained the backup command structure. Ruth Ann described how refusal would be handled through direct communication unless immediate conditions removed the possibility of waiting. Leon presented visual signals for radio failure. Caleb identified a secondary shelter point. Evelyn made notes. "This is substantially better," she said at last. No one celebrated. "Better does not mean approved," she continued. "You need a full demonstration under simulated failure conditions." "When?" Marjorie asked. 3 days. Evelyn listed the required conditions: loss of electrical power, interrupted radio communication, blocked primary route, and one resident unable to walk independently. After she left, Graham studied the weather report pinned near the telephone. "I may be able to get another week," he said. "I know someone in the state emergency office. He owes me a favor." Marjorie's expression changed. "No! It would give us more preparation time. It would also mean we remain open because someone important knows you. The result would still be safer." "For now," she said. "What happens next year when you are not here? Or when the person who owes you a favor retires?" Graham folded his arms. "You are willing to risk failure to make a point? I am unwilling to build our safety on private influence." The firmness in her voice reminded him of their first argument, but there was something else beneath it now. Fear. Marjorie touched the silver key at her throat. "I delayed reporting the road," she said. Otis looked up. She kept her attention on Graham. The drainage problem was visible before the collapse. Not this severe, but visible. "I told myself we could monitor it until spring." "Why?" "Because every report creates a review. Every review creates the possibility that someone will decide this place is too complicated to continue. If you had reported it earlier, Otis might not have gone out to inspect it alone." The admission did not excuse Graham, and it did not excuse her. That was what made it honest. Marjorie had protected Northlight House by withholding information. Graham protected people by making decisions before they could object. Different methods, the same fear. If others saw the full problem, they might make a choice neither of them could control. Graham sat at the table across from her. "I thought leaving town was the only way to stop being responsible for everyone." Marjorie gave a tired smile. "I thought hiding the cracks was the only way to keep everyone together." On the wall behind them, the empty space where Graham's original plan had hung remained visible. Marjorie placed the new plan there. It was not neat. Different handwriting covered the pages. Arrows had been crossed out and redrawn. Nell's timing chart was attached beside Ruth Ann's medical categories. Otis's equipment sketch overlapped Marcus's ground notes. Caleb's vehicle route curved around Leon's visibility markers. No single name appeared at the top. Graham looked at the crowded pages. It was less elegant than his plan. It was also more complete. "Everyone gets the full inspection report," Marjorie said. "No shortened version." "And everyone knows what happens if the demonstration fails," Graham added. She nodded. "No one protects this house by deciding what the others are allowed to know." Outside, Micah barked at her own reflection in the greenhouse glass. Hawthorne ignored her from his patch of sun. The plan on the wall did not guarantee that Northlight House would remain open. It guaranteed something more immediate. Whatever happened next, the decision would no longer be shaped by one person's strength or another person's fear. It would be faced in the open, with every hand that had helped write it. Snow began falling shortly before dusk. It came without wind, settling evenly across the birch branches and softening the tracks left by the day's preparations. By the time Graham reached Northlight House, the southern road had become a pale ribbon beneath the trees, its reflective markers glowing whenever his headlights passed over them. Tomorrow, those markers would guide the evacuation exercise. Tonight, they looked like small lights leading toward a place that might no longer be home by spring. Graham parked beside Caleb's rescue truck and remained behind the wheel for a moment. The written plan rested on the passenger seat, revised so many times that the corners had begun to curl. He had already inspected the sled brakes twice, checked the backup lanterns, and walked the lower section of the route with Marcus. There was no practical reason for him to be nervous. That did not stop him. Northlight House glowed through the snowfall. Warm yellow light filled its windows, while the greenhouse behind it gave off a softer green-blue shine. Through the glass, Graham could see broad winter leaves beneath suspended lamps and the dark shapes of watering cans hanging from a wall. When he opened the front door, the smell of fresh bread, herbs, and vegetable soup met him before anyone spoke. His first instinct was to look for equipment. The emergency bags had been lined against the wall. Coats were arranged by bedroom number. Flashlights rested beside the landline phones. Caleb's radio charger showed a steady green light. Everything was where it should be. Only then did Graham notice that the long table had been set for dinner. Marjorie had used the mismatched blue and white plates instead of the plain everyday dishes. Judith carried a loaf of bread from the kitchen, wrapped in a faded cloth embroidered with small red apples. Franklin was moving chairs so Nell's walker would fit comfortably beside the table. "This is not a meeting," Marjorie said, when she noticed Graham studying the room. Her brick-red scarf had been replaced by a burgundy cardigan, and the silver key at her throat caught the firelight. "I didn't say it was." "You were checking the exits." "I check exits." "Tonight, try checking the bread." She pointed him toward an empty chair. Caleb sat near the end of the table, his rescue coat hanging by the door. Without the heavy outer layer, he seemed less like the fire chief and more like the tired man beneath the title. Tessa Grant sat across from him in a cream sweater and sage-green vest, her auburn hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Beside the fireplace was a man Graham had not seen in several months. Reverend Elias Boone was 67, thin and slightly stooped, with silver hair brushed away from a long, gentle face. A narrow white beard framed his mouth, and a moss-green scarf rested over a dark brown wool coat. He had served the small church in Sunbreak Hollow long enough to remember marriages, funerals, illnesses, and reconciliations that everyone else preferred to forget. He rose when Graham approached. "I heard you were leaving town without giving me the chance to disapprove." Graham shook his hand. "I didn't know I needed permission." "You don't. That is what makes disapproval so convenient." Elias smiled and returned to his chair. Hawthorne lay on a thick pad beside Otis. The old dog's golden black coat had regained its healthy fullness after several days of warmth and rest, though his silver muzzle and stiff rear legs still showed his age. Micah slept against his side, her wrapped paw twitching occasionally as if she were chasing something through a dream. Graham sat near the corner of the table rather than at its head. No one commented on the choice. Marjorie served the soup herself. It was thick with potatoes, carrots, beans, and greens from Judith's winter beds. Otis cut the bread, though the first slice came out so uneven that Nell examined it as if it were a questionable financial statement. "That one has structural problems," she said. "It has character," Otis replied. "It has one side twice the size of the other." "Then give it to Caleb." Caleb accepted the large piece without protest. Conversation began with ordinary subjects. Judith complained that Micah had dug soil from a planter. Leon argued that tomorrow's visibility would remain good despite the forecast. Franklin told Caleb the rescue vehicle's left rear tread sounded different from the right. For several minutes, Graham almost forgot why they had gathered. Then the lights flickered once. Every face turned upward. The lamps steadied immediately, but the conversation did not. Judith placed her spoon down. "The generator is ready," Graham said. "I know," she replied. No one needed reassurance about the machine. What unsettled them was how quickly one small change in the room had brought tomorrow back to the table. Marjorie looked around at the residents. "We have discussed routes, equipment, and timing," she said. "We have not discussed what tomorrow means to each of us." Otis shifted in his chair. "That sounds suspiciously like feelings." "It is too late to leave," Nell told him. "The snow is getting deeper." A few people smiled, but the humor faded gently. Marjorie did not force anyone to speak. She simply waited. Otis broke the silence first. "I should not have gone out to inspect the eastern road alone." Hawthorne's ears moved at the sound of his voice. Otis looked toward the dog rather than at the people around the table. "I knew the weather was changing. I knew my knee had been unreliable. I also knew if I asked someone to come with me, they might say I should stay home." Ruth Ann leaned back in her chair. "We might have said you should not go alone." "That is not how I would have heard it." Otis rubbed his thumb across the edge of the table. "After Margaret died, everyone became very careful with me. My sister called every morning to ask whether I had eaten. My neighbors stopped asking me to repair things because they thought I needed rest." His short white mustache lifted with a humorless smile. "I had spent 40 years working with electricity. Then suddenly people watched me carry a coffee cup as if it were a complicated assignment." North Lighthouse had been the first place where Otis's skills were welcomed without anyone pretending his age did not exist. He could ask for assistance and still be trusted with responsibility. Then his hands began to shake. "I went out there because I wanted to come back with proof that I was still useful," he said. Instead, Hawthorne had to drag a puppy through the snow because I was too proud to tell anyone where I was going. No one corrected him by saying the accident was not his fault. Graham understood why. Comfort offered too quickly could become another way of refusing to hear the truth. Nell spoke next. I am not ashamed of my walker. She rested one hand on the leather-wrapped grip beside her chair. I dislike it, that is different. A faint laugh moved around the table. The walker gives me access to rooms I would otherwise avoid. It is useful. What I fear is entering a new place and having everyone notice the frame before they notice me. She looked at Graham, though there was no accusation in her expression now. People begin speaking louder. They ask the person beside me what I need. They move my belongings without asking because they have already decided assistance is more important than permission. Nell adjusted her red glasses. If North Lighthouse closes, I can survive somewhere else. What I do not know is whether I will remain visible there. The statement left no easy reply. Ruth Ann's fingers circled the face of her large digital watch. I spent years telling frightened people that I had the situation under control, she said. Most of the time they needed to hear it. She had been a paramedic for more than 3 decades. Her instincts remained quick, but her body no longer followed every decision at the same speed. Last month, I carried 2 medical supply boxes from the storage room and pretended I was not short of breath afterward. I tell everyone here to respect their limits, then treat my own limits like poor discipline. Caleb looked down at his soup. Graham suspected the admission mattered to him as a rescue professional, but he did not interrupt. Ruth Ann continued. I was angry with Graham because he treated us as though we could not assess ourselves. Part of that anger came from knowing I have not always assessed myself honestly. Marjorie folded her hands. North Lighthouse was not created to prove that age has no consequences, she said. It was created because consequences should not erase participation. Years earlier, she explained, several of them had watched friends move into well-run residences where every need was met, except the need to remain part of meaningful decisions. Schedules became something posted for them. Meals arrived without their involvement. Safety improved, but their influence over daily life steadily narrowed. We did not come here to defeat aging, Marjorie said. We came here so we could age without disappearing from our own lives. Graham felt the words settle somewhere he had avoided examining. He had nearly disappeared in another way. Not through weakness, but through usefulness. Every time someone called, Graham became a repair, a vehicle, a pair of capable hands. He had mistaken that role for a complete identity because roles were easier than relationships. A broken machine made its needs clear. People did not. Elias turned his teacup slowly between his palms. Graham, he said, what are you afraid will happen tomorrow? Equipment failure. Several people looked at him. Elias waited. Graham exhaled. That is the answer I know how to give. And the other answer? Graham glanced toward the windows. Snow drifted against the lower panes. I'm leaving Sunbreak Hollow. The room changed. No one gasped. No one demanded an explanation. The quiet was worse because it gave him space to hear his own words. I sold most of the workshop, he continued. I marked a date, February 18th. Otis stared at him. You were going to tell us? I was planning to leave. That does not require a committee. No, Marjorie said, but it may require a goodbye. Graham looked down at his hands. For years, people came to me only when something stopped working. Furnaces, engines, generators. I began to wonder whether anyone wanted me around when nothing needed repairing. The confession felt embarrassingly simple once spoken. I thought if I went somewhere no one knew me, no one would expect anything. Elias asked, and what would they know about you? Nothing. Is that freedom? Graham did not answer. Elias did not press him. He broke off a piece of bread and spread butter across it with slow care. Have you ever allowed these people to know you when you were not solving a problem? Graham's eyes moved around the table. He remembered visits to North Lighthouse. He had repaired the generator, accepted coffee while standing, then left before the cup cooled. At church, he had fixed steps, rewired lights, and cleared snow, always finding work that kept him from sitting among the congregation. "I don't know how," he admitted. Elias nodded as though Graham had finally given the useful answer. "Service can be an expression of love," he said. "It can also become a hiding place. If you are always the strongest person in the room, no one has to see what you need." Graham turned the steel ring on his left little finger. "I don't want to become another responsibility. Receiving care is not the same as assigning someone your life." Elias looked toward the residents. "Faith does not always ask a person to carry more. Sometimes it asks him to sit down before pride convinces him that exhaustion is a virtue." The fire shifted in the stone hearth. No one offered Graham a speech about how important he was. No one asked him to promise he would stay. That restraint made the room feel safer than reassurance would have. Dinner resumed slowly. Otis told a story about the first time Hawthorne entered the greenhouse and returned covered in potting soil. Nell divided an apple pie into portions so exact that Caleb accused her of using professional equipment. Judith poured more coffee. Franklin argued that his slice was smaller until Nell offered to weigh it. The familiar sounds of people living together returned. After the plates were cleared, Graham rose and reached for his winter coat. "I'm going to check the sled." Caleb looked at him. "Again?" "The temperature dropped. The brake cable may tighten." "It did not tighten 20 minutes ago." Graham put one arm into his coat. Something pressed against his boot. Hawthorne had shifted from the hearth and placed one broad paw across the toe of Graham's brown winter boot. The old dog did not lift his head. His eyes remained closed. Micah was curled against his stomach, asleep beneath the edge of his thermal coat. Graham looked down. There was no warning in the gesture, no mysterious understanding. Hawthorne was warm, tired, and unwilling to move simply because Graham had decided another inspection was necessary. Otis watched from the table. "He knows you are about to make him stand up." "I can step around him." "You could," Nell said. "That would be very on brand." Graham stood with his coat half on. Outside, the equipment waited beneath its cover. Another inspection might reveal something. More likely, it would only give him a task large enough to avoid the discomfort of remaining in the room after speaking honestly. He took off the coat. Hawthorne's paw remained on his boot as Graham sat down again. Marjorie poured him more coffee without comment. Nell placed a narrow slice of apple pie in front of him. Otis resumed his story, adding details that were almost certainly untrue. The plan was unfinished. Tomorrow remained uncertain. A failed exercise might still divide the people at the table. For once, Graham allowed those facts to remain unresolved until morning. He did not feel irresponsible. He felt present. Beyond the windows, snow continued covering the road, the greenhouse roof, and every set of tracks leading away from Northlight House. Inside, no one asked Graham to fix anything. They only made room for him to stay. Morning arrived bright enough to make the snow hurt the eyes. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Sunbreak Hollow beneath a clear, pale blue sky. Ice covered the outer branches of the birch trees, and every movement of sunlight sent brief flashes across the hillside. Northlight House had been awake since before dawn. Coats were arranged by the main entrance. Medical pouches waited in labeled bins. Backup lanterns had been checked, then checked again by someone other than Graham. The powered equipment remained covered because the new plan relied first on walking, assisted movement, and the tracked rescue vehicle waiting below. Graham stood near the southern door, wearing his dark green canvas winter coat over the olive combat shirt. A radio crossed his chest, though the exercise rules required him to behave as if the main channel failed. He did not feel calm. He felt prepared, which was not the same thing. Outside, Caleb Rourke positioned members of the volunteer fire crew at the upper and lower checkpoints. His yellow-brown rescue coat made him easy to identify against the snow. One firefighter waited with the tracked vehicle at the lower clearing, while another remained near Northlight House with emergency equipment. Tessa Grant had established a medical station at the gathering point. She wore a rust-colored quilted coat over sage-green scrubs and had already warned everyone that a simulated emergency did not excuse real carelessness. Marcus Dale walked the southern route one final time, testing the packed surface with a metal probe and examining the handline anchors. He placed a small green tag on every point that had passed inspection. Evelyn Frost arrived, carrying her waterproof clipboard and a sealed envelope containing the exercise conditions. She did not open it immediately. "Before we begin," she said, "this is a controlled demonstration. Any participant may stop at any time. A safety concern overrides the exercise. No one is being tested for courage." Nell adjusted her mustard yellow hat. "That is fortunate. I did not bring any." "You brought 3 pencils," Otis said. "Those are more reliable." A weighted rescue mannequin lay on the sled beneath a thermal blanket, representing a resident unable to walk independently. It had been given the name Mr. Birch by Franklin, who claimed every passenger deserved a name. Micah remained inside the greenhouse with Judith. The puppy had recovered enough to object loudly to being excluded, but Tessa had decided 10 weeks of age did not qualify her for emergency planning. Hawthorne stood beside Nell. The old German Shepherd wore his moss-gray thermal coat and a plain canvas harness. He would accompany Nell only from the house to the first rest point, then remain with Tessa. No pulling, running, or extended climbing. Otis checked the enlarged brake release on the sled. His fingers trembled slightly, but the looped handle gave him enough room to work without needing a precise grip. Graham watched him. Otis noticed. "If you stare any harder," he said, "you'll loosen the bolts." Graham looked away. Evelyn opened the envelope. "Scenario begins at 9:13. Northlight House has lost external power. The primary generator has failed to engage. Main radio communication is unavailable." Leon switched off the lamps in the central room while Judith covered the control panel to prevent anyone from consulting live readouts. Marjorie activated the backup command structure. "Ruth Ann, medical readiness. Franklin, room check. Leon, visual signals. Nell, timing." Each person acknowledged the assignment. No one waited for Graham. That fact no longer unsettled him as much as it once would have. Ruth Ann moved through the medication station, verifying the color-coded pouches against the agreed information cards. Franklin checked each bedroom and attached a white marker to the door handle when it was clear. Leon placed battery lanterns in the windows to simulate the loss of radio communication between the building and the route teams. Nell started the timer. "First group ready in 5 minutes and 40 seconds, she announced. Graham checked the clock. Her estimate was almost exact. The first residents left Northlight House in pairs. No one rushed. The order was based on mobility, weather tolerance, and assigned responsibilities rather than a simple strongest to weakest ranking. Nell walked beside Hawthorne, her gray walker moving steadily across the packed snow. The old dog matched her pace without pulling ahead. Every few steps, his right hind leg showed a brief stiffness, but he remained balanced. At the first rest point, Tessa took Hawthorne's lead. "Your contribution is complete," she told him. Hawthorne looked toward Otis, then lowered himself onto the insulated pad as though he had personally negotiated the arrangement. The first stage proceeded smoothly. Too smoothly, Graham thought. Then Evelyn raised one hand. A firefighter farther down the route moved a lightweight barrier across the path. Branches and fabric panels had been arranged to resemble a fallen tree without creating real danger. Leon saw the red marker and relayed the signal with a lantern. "Southern route blocked below the second turn." The group stopped. For 1 second, all heads turned toward Graham. His body responded before his judgment did. He saw the alternate western line, the grade, the transfer point, and the position Caleb would need to take with the tracked vehicle. The order rose into his throat. "Move everyone west. Transfer Nell now. Shift the sled team behind the birches." He did not speak. Marjorie stood beside the route map clipped to a board. "What do you see that we have not seen?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was an invitation to contribute without taking possession. Graham pointed toward the western line. The snowpack there is firmer because the wind cleared the upper layer. It reconnects with the lower road beyond the barrier. Leon studied the slope. I know that path. The turn is visible from the old mail marker. But the middle section is too steep for my walker, Nell said. Ruth Ann looked toward the sled. We could move Nell from the walker to the sled before the steep section. Graham shook his head. Not from here. The ground slopes toward the drainage edge. Marcus stepped off the packed route and examined a level shelf farther west. There, he said. Stable base. Enough room for a controlled transfer. Caleb spoke from the lower checkpoint using the backup hand signal relayed by his firefighter. Franklin interpreted it. He can reposition the tracked vehicle, but he needs the group 3 minutes later than planned. Nell checked her timing sheet. Then the walking group pauses at the upper marker. We transfer only at Marcus's point. The sled proceeds first after the turn, not last. Ruth Ann adjusted the medical order. Judith moves with Nell. Franklin stays with the second walking group. Leon guides the front. The revised plan formed through separate voices. Graham could see the entire solution now, but it no longer belonged to him. That was the point. They resumed. At the transfer shelf, the team locked the sled in place. Nell set the walker aside and sat on the padded seat without being strapped down until she had tested the hand grip, the brake signal, and her own balance. Ready? Ruth Ann asked. Nell looked toward the slope. Ready enough. No one told her that was insufficient. Otis moved to the rear brake. Several county observers stood a short distance away, recording the procedure. Their presence changed him. Graham saw it in the tightening of Otis's shoulders and the quick movement of his jaw. Otis pulled the large release loop. The mechanism resisted. He released it, repositioned his hand, and tried again. The pin slipped from his glove and struck the side of the frame. The sound was small. Otis stopped moving. His fingers trembled harder. One of the observers looked down at her notes. No one said anything, but Otis appeared to feel every eye on him. Graham took one step forward. He could fit the pin in less than 3 seconds. His hand had already begun to rise when he saw Hawthorne standing beside Tessa at the rest point. The old dog had been lying down. Now he was looking directly at Otis. Hawthorne rose slowly, waited for Tessa to loosen the lead, and walked back toward the equipment team. He did not hurry. He did not bark. He stopped beside Otis and leaned one shoulder against the man's leg. Otis closed his eyes. His breathing had become shallow, but he placed one hand on Hawthorne's silver muzzle and kept it there. Graham remained several feet away. "You can wait," he said. Otis opened his eyes. "The clock is running." "The clock can run." Nell sat quietly in the sled. Ruth Ann did not touch the mechanism. Caleb did not signal for anyone else to take over. No one rescued Otis from being observed. They simply allowed him enough time to continue. Otis bent again. This time he held the loop with both hands, aligned the enlarged pin, and pressed it into the locking channel. The mechanism clicked. He tested it once. "Brake secure." Nell looked back at him. "Then let us stop standing in the cold admiring it." A few people laughed, including Otis. The sled moved forward. The western route added several minutes. At one point, Leon's hearing aids picked up only wind, so the team used the lantern signals exactly as planned. Franklin misjudged the spacing between the walking groups and corrected it after Ruth Ann pointed out the crowding near the bend. The exercise did not become graceful. That made it credible. At the lower clearing, Caleb backed the tracked vehicle along the line Franklin had recommended. The turn was tight, but the rear tread remained on stable ground. Marcus watched the snow beneath it and gave the final signal. The weighted mannequin was transferred first. Nell chose to stand from the sled and walk the last short distance with her frame. "I would like the record to show," she told Evelyn, "that Mr. Birch received better transportation than I did." "He did not complain," Evelyn replied. "He lacks standards." When the final participant reached the gathering point, Nell stopped the timer. They had exceeded the target by 4 minutes and 12 seconds. No one cheered. Graham looked at the number and felt the old instinct return. 4 minutes could matter. The delays could be reduced. Otis's brake station could be reassigned. The transition point could be moved. Evelyn called everyone together. "The exercise is complete," she said. She reviewed her notes without softening the findings. The initial room-clearing process was efficient. Medical information remained accessible without exposing unnecessary private details. The southern route required additional reflective marking near the western turn. Lantern signals needed a second confirmation pattern. The transfer team should rehearse once each month. Then she looked at Otis. The brake delay must be addressed. Otis's face tightened. Evelyn continued. Not by removing Mr. Keene from the task, by establishing a second trained operator and a verbal pause procedure. Otis looked up. "A redundant system," Marcus said. "Exactly." Evelyn turned another page. "You exceeded the time target. However, no participant was moved beyond an agreed physical limit. The blocked route was identified and bypassed. The failed communication method was replaced. The team adapted without abandoning the command structure." She removed a document from the rear of the clipboard. North Lighthouse will receive a 90-day temporary extension of its residential safety certificate. For a moment, no one reacted. Marjorie's hand moved to the silver key at her throat. Ruth Ann released a breath. Caleb smiled into his red-gray beard. Otis lowered himself onto the sled's edge while Hawthorne sat beside him. Evelyn signed the document against the flat surface of her clipboard, then handed it to Marjorie. "This approval is conditional. Training must continue. The spring road repair must proceed. The deficiencies remain real." "We understand," Marjorie said. Evelyn glanced toward the route behind them. "A safe plan is not one in which nothing goes wrong. That plan does not exist." Her gaze moved across the group. A safe plan allows people to adapt without requiring one person to become the hero and without treating anyone else as the burden. Graham looked at the tracks covering the hillside. Some belonged to walkers, some belonged to boots. The sled runners had left 2 parallel lines through the snow. The tracked vehicle had pressed a broad pattern into the lower clearing. Hawthorne's paw prints ended at the first rest point, then resumed when he returned to Otis. No single set of tracks reached the gathering area alone. North Lighthouse had not remained open because Graham had found the correct answer. It remained open because Nell understood time. Ruth Ann understood care. Otis understood equipment. Marcus understood ground. Caleb understood access. Leon understood the road, and Marjorie understood the people who called the place home. Graham had seen where the pieces connected. That was enough. Marjorie folded the signed extension and placed it inside her coat. Above them, sunlight moved across the ice-covered birches. The branches flashed one after another, as though the hill were briefly filled with small lamps. The road below North Lighthouse still needed work. The eastern entrance was still broken. The temporary route remained imperfect, but it belonged to all of them now, and because it belonged to all of them, no one had to walk it alone. The certificate was framed and placed near the main entrance of North Lighthouse. Marjorie refused to hang it above the fireplace. "That wall is for things we value," she said, "not things that give us permission to exist." Instead, the 90-day extension went beside the evacuation map, where everyone could see both the approval and the responsibilities attached to it. For several days after the exercise, life returned to its ordinary rhythm. Judith trimmed winter greens in the greenhouse. Franklin checked the rescue vehicle's turning measurements against his notes. Ruth Ann replaced the medical supplies used during the demonstration, and Nell recalculated the monthly budget after discovering that reflective trail markers cost more than anyone had predicted. Graham continued visiting North Lighthouse, but no one summoned him to take control. He helped Marcus prepare plans for the permanent spring repair. He taught Leon how to test the backup radio battery. When Otis adjusted the sled brake, Graham stood beside him and waited to be asked before touching the mechanism. The change was not dramatic enough for anyone to announce. That was how Graham knew it might last. One afternoon, Marjorie spread a county map across the dining table. Small blue marks identified houses occupied by older residents living alone beyond the center of Sunbreak Hollow. Northlight House had 8 people, a greenhouse, backup power, and a volunteer fire chief involved in our planning, she said. Most of these homes have one person and a telephone. Caleb leaned over the map. Some have radio access, not many. And some do not want the town keeping a list of their medical conditions, Ruth Ann added. They should not have to surrender their privacy to receive help, Marjorie said. But they should have a way to tell someone when they want it. Nell placed 3 small porch lamps on the table. Otis had rebuilt them from weather-resistant housings and fitted each with a rechargeable battery. One lamp glowed white, another yellow, and the third red. Otis tapped the white one. This means everything is fine, no visit needed. The yellow lamp followed. This means call first or come by, depending on what the homeowner selected. Finally, red. This means contact emergency services. Caleb examined the switches. Too easy to activate by accident. Not after I add the covers. Battery life? 72 hours without external power. Cold weather test? Otis looked offended. Do you think I spent 40 years working with electricity so you could ask useful questions? The program became the Winter Porch Network. Participation was voluntary. Every resident chose what each light meant for that particular home, who could call, who could visit, and what information, if any, could be shared with the fire department. The lights were only the visible part. Each participant selected 1 or 2 check-in partners. Small radios were offered to houses where telephone service regularly failed. Emergency information cards were stored in sealed envelopes and contained only what the homeowner had agreed responders might need. No one was required to hide a key outside. No one was required to reveal a diagnosis. No one was entered into the system simply because a neighbor believed it would be good for them. Ruth Ann conducted workshops on preparing medication and warm clothing for outages. Nell managed the assistance fund, recording every purchase down to the final battery. Caleb connected the network to the volunteer fire department without turning it into a government inspection program. Otis tested the lamps. Then he tested them again because he did not trust anyone who claimed a battery had been tested only once. Graham installed mounting brackets, but refused the title of project director. When people asked who was in charge, Marjorie answered, "Of which part?" By early spring, 23 houses had joined. The eastern road was repaired after the ground thawed. New drainage pipe was buried beneath a reinforced roadbed, and Marcus inspected the work before the county reopened the route to emergency vehicles. Northlight House no longer needed its temporary southern access. They kept it maintained anyway. The path had become more than an emergency route. On clear mornings, residents used the gentler slope for short walks. Rest benches were installed at Nell's suggested intervals. Reflective markers remained along the birches, not because disaster was expected, but because visibility was useful even on ordinary days. Graham returned to his workshop at the end of March. The Florida map still lay on the desk beneath a thin layer of dust. February 18th had passed more than a month earlier. He folded the map along its existing creases, placed it in a drawer, and went outside. The for sale sign stood near the end of his driveway, tilted from melting snow. Graham pulled it from the ground. He did not reopen Vale Winter Repair. That business had been built around the belief that every broken thing eventually became his responsibility. Reopening it under the same rules would have returned him to the life he had been trying to escape. Instead, the workshop opened on the first and third Saturday of each month as a community repair space. A painted board beside the door listed the rules. Bring the object. Stay for the lesson. Learn what can be maintained. Know when replacement is safer than repair. Graham limited the number of projects accepted each day. Otis handled lamps, radios, and small electrical equipment. Caleb taught seasonal heating safety. Judith organized coffee and made sure oily gloves stayed away from the food table. Nell managed the parts fund and refused to approve any purchase described only as miscellaneous. Graham's old toolbox remained beneath the bench, but it was no longer the only one there. The first morning the workshop opened, Harvey Lott arrived carrying a thermostat and wearing the cautious expression of a man approaching a conversation he had avoided. Harvey had grown heavier through the winter. His gray hair escaped beneath a faded cap, and his hands remained deep inside the pockets of his brown coat. "I replaced the furnace," he said. Graham nodded. "Good." Caleb gave me 3 names. I called all of them before making a decision. "Better." Harvey placed the thermostat on the bench. "I thought I should learn how the new system shuts down." Graham looked at him. Harvey did not apologize for the night he had blamed Graham. Graham did not demand that he do so before receiving help. Instead, Graham turned the thermostat over and pointed to the emergency controls. "Take off your gloves," he said. "You're doing this part." Harvey stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he carried the thermostat, a written maintenance schedule, and enough understanding to know which problems required a licensed technician. Graham watched him go without feeling abandoned or indispensable. That unfamiliar balance felt more satisfying than gratitude. The first yellow porch light appeared during an April cold snap. It belonged to Evelyn Pike, a 79-year-old retired seamstress who lived near the Western Ridge. Her furnace was running, but the house smelled faintly of overheated dust after months of limited use. Graham saw the yellow light from his kitchen window. His coat was already in his hand before he remembered the system. Yellow did not mean Graham. Yellow meant follow the homeowner's chosen plan. He checked the contact sheet. Evelyn had selected Caleb as the first caller and her neighbor Judith as the first visitor. Graham was listed only for equipment questions after the initial check. For several uncomfortable minutes, he did nothing. Then Caleb called to report that Evelyn was safe. Judith had opened the windows briefly, and a heating technician would inspect the furnace in the morning. The smell came from dust on the vents. "No emergency," Caleb said. "Do you need me?" "No." The word should have felt like rejection. Instead, Graham looked through the window at the yellow light glowing across the dark slope and understood what the network had accomplished. Someone had asked for help. The right people had answered. The world had continued without Graham being at the center of it. He made coffee and remained home. By the following winter, the winter porch network included nearly 50 houses scattered across Sunbreak Hollow. Micah had grown into a long-legged young German shepherd with one ear that still leaned slightly when she became excited. She raced through North Lighthouse as if every hallway had been built for her personal use, skidded across the polished floor, and regularly returned to trouble Hawthorne. Hawthorne had aged more visibly. The golden fur around his face had faded, and the stiffness in his right hind leg lasted longer after he stood. He no longer walked the southern road or followed Otis through the entire greenhouse. Most afternoons he slept beneath a window where sunlight warmed the floor. He still hid his medicine beneath the edge of his blanket. He still gave Micah a tired look when she pulled his tail. And when Otis's hands shook harder than usual, Hawthorne still moved slowly across the room and settled beside his left leg. The old dog no longer carried anyone through the snow. He did not need to. On the anniversary of the storm, heavy snow returned to Sunbreak Hollow. Wind covered the roads and bent the birch branches low. Electricity flickered twice before the backup systems activated. Graham stepped onto his porch late that evening. A white lamp glowed beside his own door. Beyond the workshop, more lights appeared across the valley. 1 on the western ridge, 3 near the frozen lake, a row of white points along the county road. They did not mean the people inside those houses needed no one. They meant no help had been requested tonight. They meant someone had checked the batteries, made a choice, and remained connected to others without surrendering the right to be left in peace. The next morning, Marjorie brought Hawthorne to the workshop in her car. The dog stepped onto the snow carefully. His movements were slower than the year before, and Graham walked beside him without reaching down unless Hawthorne needed support. At the porch, the old German shepherd stopped. This was the place where he had once arrived, pulling Mika through the snow. The boards had been repaired since then, but a shallow scratch from the canvas sling remained near the first step. Hawthorne smelled the mark. Then he lay down beneath the roof. Graham sat beside him. Through the workshop door came the sound of ordinary work. Otis was teaching Harvey how to test a battery. Nell was questioning a receipt. Micah ran between boots until Judith ordered someone to move the coffee before the dog discovered it. Across the valley, church bells carried through the cold morning. Graham rested one hand against the silver fur around Hawthorne's neck. Loyalty was not a promise to solve every problem for another person. It was not standing so close that no one else could choose a direction. Sometimes loyalty meant keeping a light on, opening a door when it was needed, and trusting that someone else might be strong enough to carry part of the weight. Hawthorne closed his eyes. Graham remained on the porch until the cold reached through his coat. Then Otis called from inside. "We need someone who can read this wiring diagram without inventing new words." Graham opened the door. He did not enter first. He waited while Hawthorne rose, slowly and on his own, then walked beside the old dog into the crowded workshop. Graham no longer stood at the head of the line. For the first time in his life, he stood comfortably among the people in it. And that, he understood, was what coming home had always meant. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop carrying every burden alone. Graham believed being needed was the same as being loved. But Hawthorne and the people of North Lighthouse showed him a gentler truth. Real strength makes room for others to help, choose, and stand beside us. In everyday life, God's guidance may not arrive through a great miracle. Sometimes it appears as an open door, a light left on, or someone quietly saying, "You don't have to do this alone." What did this story remind you of in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, dignity, and hope. May God give you the courage to ask for help and the grace to receive it.